I think there's also a lot of room for the hermeneutics of suspicion going on here, and
Yeah.
which I think sometimes are legitimate. So I'll tell you from my perspective, um, I think I think evolution theory is beautiful and elegant, has a lot of explanatory power, especially for what we might call micro events. It might explain why we have finches with longer beaks and shorter beaks, but it does not give a background narrative on how they have the common ancestor of a whale, a hamster, or a tomato. You know,
Right.
it's there's limits on how far back we can go with what we are observing. It can
Yes.
explain why um, lions and gazelles can make each other faster over a few generations.
Hmm.
But then there's also, but it does not necessarily explain and like where that lions and gazelles have a common ancestor.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they do or don't. What I'm saying is that there's a presumption that kind of process carried back far enough results in what you might call macro differences rather than micro differences. And I'm not convinced that there's scientific evidence that the macro differences can be supported with the things that we observe now,
Yeah.
right? And then
Right.
you couple that with places where I know dishonesty has taken place. For example, when Nova was filming with Carl Sagan in Glen Rose, Texas, there were dinosaur footprints in the bed of the river that they absolutely refused to film and comment on. Why? Why not? That's the evidence. Why refuse to comment on it? They had dinosaur footprints right next to human footprints. They absolutely refused to comment on that. They didn't film it, didn't look at it, wouldn't. Why wouldn't they do that? And then there's things in the textbooks. There's things that keep popping up in the textbooks that have been demonstrated to be non-scientific over the years. And um, some examples like the peppered moth thing shows up, and they actually glued the moths to the tree to tell their story. The embryonic recapitulation that first appeared from a guy named Ernst Haeckel, who
Mm.
was demonstrated to be fraudulent by his own university in 1874, and that stuff is still showing up in textbooks. And there's example after example after example of this. Um, and so why, if we're just dealing with science, why is there such a bias toward misinformation? Why do we have to use misinformation to present this thing? So it makes me very skeptical of it in general. And
Yeah.
when the people in the white coats are writing the textbooks to try to tell us the things, I'm like, well, I have documented evidences of fraud taking place. How do I know? You're sense making 101. How do I know I can believe what these guys are saying? And that does not necessarily mean that any particular alternative view is true. I'm not saying the fact that these guys are lying through their false teeth means that, the young earth creation story is true. It's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that what's their motivation for lying? What's their motivation for not showing all the evidence?
Right.
That's a question. Um, that's a question that I ask. That's a question that I have an issue with. Why lie about it? And could we do something to get all the lies out of the textbooks? And how could we like really approach this dispassionately? Where I feel like both people who want creation to be true, or like a biblical young earth creation to be true, and people who very vehemently don't want it to be true, they're both conflating and construing evidence
Hmm.
and ridiculing and stigmatizing each other. Like if you entertain the idea that evolution might not be true, then you're just as bad as a flat earther or something else like that. I mean,
Right.
why do we got to talk that way?
So
I
I'd like to point out to any audience members that I think this is a an important moment because I've experienced this myself. If you feel like in the middle of listening to this conversation that pressure somewhere in your body, like your chest,
That's Jesus telling you to send $1,000 to this ministry and put your hands on the screen. I'm
That's
just
probably that's probably because there's some sort of ideological stronghold on one end or another, and I know what that feels
yeah.
like. Um, but I can
So you
also,
have like an attachment. You might be attached to the a particular young Earth creation narrative, or you might be attached to uh, an anti-creation version of evolution that gets triggered when you start to hear people question some of these things.
yeah, and I would say that kind of, I think that both sides of the camp would try to demoralize you uh if you said something like, I don't really know. I'm
Right,
quote
right.
agnostic on the thing. On the whole thing, I think the wisest thing that you can do is say, I don't really know. Uh
Well, yeah. At the end of the day, we weren't there. You
I
know,
think,
I,
but I think I'd like to encourage the, at least sitting in, dealing with the uncomfortable feeling and the insecurity of, I really don't know.
mhm.
I really probably can't know. Uh and when the reality of that,
Or you could say something like, "Let's fact number one: I cannot experientially know.
right.
Like I
Yeah.
cannot go back
Yeah.
and physically be there at the beginning
And kind
to
of like
experience it."
introduce a little bit of stoicism there and sit with the uncertainty and realize, well, I can't control the world. I can't control most of the things, like all of the things. I would stay more, try and get a grip or calibrate what you actually are in control of, and put
Yeah,
more of your
yeah.
effort towards focusing and honing those those capacities that you actually experientially do have control of. And I think that that's where the reversal will start to happen, where you will start to feel more, a little bit more formed, keeping yourself more formed and upright in a conversation or in a
So
moment.
yeah, so like a formed, maybe emotionally regulated. And I mean, what popped into my head there is that maybe if I'm emotionally attached to a particular view of the origin of the planet or human life or whatever, and I feel that challenge and I start to feel that pressure in my body go into fight or flight mode, that kind of makes me vulnerable to being deformed because I'm dysregulated and
Yes.
part of me is attached out to this idea which I cannot experientially validate. So
Yeah,
maybe detach myself from that so that it's not an appendage that can be cut off by somebody else.
that's awesome. Yeah, I'm using that illustration, or that you just I'm using that because I feel uncomfortable, with these kinds of things.
I do too. I feel uncomfortable. I have I grew up, well, I'm trying to think. I was probably in the sixth grade at some point when I can't remember how old I was, but I went to some kind of seminar and it was basically some kind of answers in Genesis stuff was presented,
Hmm.
and I felt validated. Like, oh, I need to learn this stuff. This proves the creation that I believe in.
Yeah.
And even as late as say 2012 or 13, maybe 2014, I actually gave a series of 5 lectures
Hmm.
on young earth creationism to a church body and posted those videos on YouTube. There's a lot of information that I have that I feel like some people are overlooking, but at the same time, I also want to back away from where I was to realize that there might be a different way to look at things.
Yeah.
So I, I feel like confessing something that I haven't told anybody publicly on the channel yet. Maybe I have. I don't know. I think I've said it in FSI when we're offline. Are you familiar? So I'll just say this. I am highly entertained by the Zechariah Sitchin's take on the Sumerian tablets.
Hmm.
Highly
Hmm.
entertained by it.
Hmm.
I'm not saying I believe it. I'm not saying I disbelieve it, but I'm super entertained by it. and I really enjoy watching videos, reading books on that kind of thing. And they have their own, you have different people showing how that version of things matches up with the biblical creation account. And
Hmm.
then it all ties in with the Book of Enoch, that kind of thing. I am just entertained as can be,
Hmm.
exposing myself to that kind of stuff. And so there's part of me that I don't know why, there's part of me that kind of wants that to be true. And I'm not married to it, I'm not attached to it, but
Yeah.
it's super interesting. And it makes me
Yeah.
wonder why that exists. And if something like that happened, how else would we know than if somebody wrote about it? Which is the way I feel about a lot of stuff in scripture too. Well, if it really did happen, how else would we know unless somebody wrote about it? Yeah, the Bible is a book that can help spawn transformation, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't contain anything that's not literally true or
Right.
that is literally true.
So this kind of reminds me of me and you talked about the Da Vinci Code because you and I read it when it came out. That was like
Yeah.
one of the first, like I was captivated by that. And I think I had that same sort of like,
Yeah, I very much enjoyed that book. I felt
I
like
felt
I
like I
had
wanted it to be
something
true.
that other people didn't have. Well, the problem, by the time I read the Da Vinci Code, I had already studied all the manuscript evidence.
Oh,
So
okay.
when it came to that, I knew that what they were presenting,
Was
the
fic
story they were
was
presenting
fictitious.
was absolute bunk because they were
Yeah.
overlooking a whole bunch of facts, which I happened to be aware of.
Right, right.
But everything else about it was very compelling and fun and that sort of stuff.
I felt that sensation with when I read that book. Finding like, oh, this would be cool if I kind of want this to be like the actual thing. But then ultimately, I think I only wanted it to be actually the case only because of its power to inform me on what I could do,
Hey,
not because there was some sort of there
I
was
want you to
any
keep
sort of
talking, but I'm going
gain.
to turn my camera off just
Okay.
for a second because I want to get some books, maybe if I can get them fast. But you wanted it to inform you on the power of what you could do.
Yeah, like I wanted it the Da Vinci Code or like things like that to be like the actual case. Like you were saying with the those books or videos that you were interested in. And I just found it captivating and it gives a little bit of an insight into, I think, into why we're captivated by certain things because we want them to be true insofar as they possess a power that we can, I'm going to steal from Doug here, borrow for a moment and allow it to tell us about how the world
Mhm,
could be and
mhm.
speculate on, oh, so what does my life actually mean if the Da Vinci Code was good and the Holy Grail is actually, spoiler alert, the bloodline of Christ, and that the heirs of or the descendants of Jesus Christ are actually physically still here.
The Merovingian line of kings and all that.
Right. You know, like what does that mean? And so that's really the whole important part of, you know, when you're kind of seeking your own biases and playing with them or articulating them and moving them around and opening them up and seeing like, well, I'm biased towards this thing and I'm attached to it because of what it means, and what it means infers about who I can be in the future. So is if I cast myself into the future and ask myself some, maybe some critical questions, maybe when I get back down the line and I look back at that meaningful thing or that bias that I'm attached to, maybe I really want to let it go. Or maybe I want to, dig into it a little bit more
More and
or
more.
see what it's like at this angle and how it allows me to present and formulate myself in this situation.
Yeah, so the idea that the Merovingian line of kings is still here, from my stage three fundamentalist perspective that I held at the time, I was more like, oh, this is amazing because maybe this is going to be the line of reasoning that's used by the Antichrist to prove that he should be the world ruler.
Right.
Everyone's going to, oh, look, I am the descendant of Jesus of Nazareth. You
Ah,
see what I'm
okay.
saying?
I
So
do.
that so it I found it compelling for that reason. I used a little predictive speculation there
Right.
from a so I took these books after reading Da Vinci Code. I got this book and read it, Holy Blood, Holy Grail,
Mm-hmm.
for those who can't see it on the camera. And I think this is mentioned as being, I think Robert Langdon in the book saw this on Teague's bookshelf when he went to talk to him and
Okay.
noticed it, right?
Okay.
And then, so this talks about like basically all the speculative theory from which Dan Brown gets his stuff comes from this book and this book here, Messianic Legacy. And you'll notice that you got Henry Bagent and Lincoln are the authors of both of them. Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln are the triplet authors of both of these books. And all the information that comes into the Da Vinci Code really came from these books. Storyline in those isn't as fun, but the information was there, and I was like devouring this stuff, like because I'm
Yeah.
gonna uncover where the Antichrist is gonna come from. Let me see if I can rehash in our timeline. We have Charles Darwin shows up right after Lyle, and then you have World War One kind of shifts everybody into a lot of the theological landscape kind of shifts into amillennialism there.
Mm,
And then World War II, of course, Alfred North Whitehead is there from 1861 to what, like 1947. So he's coming out with his stuff right around World War II. At the same time of World War II, you have the Nazi stuff, which should wake up the entire globe.
mm-hmm,
And between 1917 and then you have the Bolshevik Revolution over in Russia,
mm-hmm,
and then they became a necessary, if not desirable, ally during World War II to help defeat Russia on that front. Dawkins and them start coming out. You have postmodernism showing up in the 60s and 70s, and then you have Derrida and Foucault and those guys, and then Dawkins and his crew are doing all their work in the 1970s and 80s, and then 9/11 gives them the perfect excuse to come out with all the anti-stage
yeah.
3 God stuff.
Yeah. Can I make you made this connection, and I think that it should be more explicit. I didn't see the connection between the postmodernists and the new atheists.
Now, so you're connecting the new atheists
Yeah.
with
No, with the
postmodernism.
postmodernists. Well, I just noticed that you in your timeline you had put them right next to each other, and I think that the the postmodern revolution comes from France primarily and comes over into America in the universities. And remember how I did couple the emergence of the new atheists after 9/11 because of the dormant power of the universities, right?
Right.
They got coupled together in order to, make their move against the religious world. And I think that the postmodernists were definitely a significant missing link in the timeline. So I just wanted to highlight when you brought that up that I think that you remember me saying that the philosophers were absent for all of this.
Right.
Well, the postmodernists are philosophers, and they
Mm-hmm.
are the last of the um you kind of don't know what to call the philosophers of modernity. You don't like the postmodernists are like the last genre of philosophers that there are.
Mm,
And so it's like it stops, like history of philosophy stops with them, you
mm.
know? And so it's kind of like they cut us all off. The postmodernists kind of cut us all off from our history, and I think that the
That's
absence of
interesting.
philosophers is probably a byproduct of their whole program, actually.